Snow drifted across the plains like a slow-moving memory, soft enough to hush the world, and yet heavy enough to shape it. The stagecoach crawled through the whitened quiet, wheels creaking in protest with every stubborn turn. Inside, Clara Whitlow pressed her gloved fingers to the frosted window, watching the wilderness move past in pale waves. Her breath left small clouds on the glass, fading as quickly as they formed, much like the life she had left behind. 24 years had carved more sorrow into her than most women twice her age, but there was still a stubborn hope tucked somewhere inside her, a quiet ember refusing to die out in the cold. She had not planned on heading west for Christmas, but plans had a way of slipping through her fingers like thawing snow. When her fiancé ended their engagement with the flatness of a man choosing a different coat for winter, she found herself standing on a lonely street with her heart hollowed out. She told herself she needed work, needed distraction, needed distance, but deep down she simply needed a place where her bruised spirit might breathe again. The ad in the newspaper offered pay, shelter, and the promise of Christmas meals for a ranch house. She answered it without hesitation, chasing something she could not name. As the stagecoach pulled up to Cane Ranch, the first thing Clara noticed was the size. Wooden fences spidered across acres of land, cattle huddled against the cold, smoke rising from chimneys in slow ribbons. The second thing she noticed was the silence, deep, expectant, almost judgmental. The coachman helped her down, her boots sinking into the snow with a soft crunch, and there she stood with one small trunk and the weight of a life that no longer fit anywhere. The main house door opened before she could steady her thoughts. Luther Kane stepped out, shoulders sharp beneath a fitted wool coat, his expression carved from stone. He looked her over not with curiosity, not with kindness, but with the calculated eye of a man assessing merchandise. Clara straightened her back, feeling the familiar pang of being evaluated, found wanting, and yet forced to stand her ground. Luther asked no questions about her journey. He simply gestured her forward and led her toward the kitchen, as though she were just another tool arriving late for work. She kept pace, though something inside her shivered that had nothing to do with the cold. Mrs. Calder, an older widow with warm eyes and a creased smile, greeted her inside. The kitchen was blessedly warm, fire crackling beneath an iron pot, scents of herbs and wood smoke filling the air. Clara exhaled for the first time in hours. Mrs. Calder placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, telling her where she would sleep, where supplies were kept, how the ranch hands always appreciated a good meal. It was the kindest voice Clara had heard in months, and she clung to it quietly. When left alone for a moment, she brushed her fingertips across the worn wooden counter, whispering a promise to herself that she would do good work here, even if her heart felt thin as parchment. But across the yard, someone else had taken notice of her arrival. Through the kitchen window, Clara saw a tall figure near the corral, sleeves rolled above powerful arms despite the winter wind. His hair, long and dark as river stone, moved with the breeze, and though he stood still, he gave the impression of a mountain that had chosen to walk among men. He was repairing a broken fence rail with steady, patient movements. When his eyes finally lifted toward her, the moment stretched like a held breath. He did not stare. He did not offer a smirk or a bold greeting. He simply dipped his head in acknowledgement, a quiet nod from a man who saw without taking. Something warm flickered inside her ribs before she turned away, unsure of what to make of him. Later, as Clara carried a small stack of linens to her little room off the kitchen, she saw him again through a gap in the doorway. This time, he was speaking to Ezra, the young stable boy, his voice low and calm. Ezra laughed at something he said. Even from a distance, Clara could see gentleness in his posture, a steadiness she had forgotten men could possess. Mrs. Calder passed by and murmured his name. Tawa Blackthorn, the ranch's Apache scout, quiet as dawn and twice as watchful. Clara tucked that name into her mind like something delicate that required care. Night settled over the ranch early, winter pressing its cold fingers against every window. Clara busied herself with unpacking, placing her apron on a hook, lining her spices along a narrow shelf, trying to fill the small quiet room with something that resembled a life. She lit a little lantern near her bedside, the flame wobbling uncertainly before steadying itself, and she imagined she shared something with that flame. A moment later, the floorboards creaked lightly, and Clara stepped out to find a neat stack of firewood placed beside her door. No footsteps retreated down the hall. No one claimed the gesture. But she knew who had done it, and the knowledge settled in her chest like a secret meant to be kept warm. When she returned to the kitchen, she found Luther inspecting supplies with a rigid impatience. He told her she would work long hours preparing meals for the ranch crew, then added in the same breath that she must not expect praise or softness. She nodded, though irritation pricked at her. She was here to work, yes, but she was not built of wood and bone just to be spoken over. She felt the old familiar ache of being diminished, and she tucked it beneath her ribs before it could spill out where someone might see it. Much later, when the house grew quiet and the ranch settled beneath its blanket of winter, Clara stepped outside for air. Snowflakes landed on her lashes, melting into cool trails down her cheeks. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the stillness seep into her, trying to convince herself that this place might offer something more than labor and loneliness. When she opened her eyes again, she saw a shadow moving near the barn. Tawa emerged into the pale moonlight, his silhouette tall against the drifting snow. For the briefest moment, he hesitated, as though debating whether to approach. Then he lifted his hand in a slow, respectful greeting, a silent gesture that carried more warmth than any words Luther had offered her all day. And in that quiet winter moment, Clara felt something shift, soft, small, but undeniable. A feeling that something on this ranch was about to change her life in ways she did not yet understand. Snow clung to the eaves of the ranch house like soft white lace, trembling whenever a gust of wind swept across the open plains. Dawn had barely stretched its pale fingers across the sky when Clara Whitlow lit the kitchen stove, coaxing flames to life with patient breaths. The warmth washed over her face, a relief after stepping out of a night that felt colder than bone. She moved through the kitchen with quiet purpose, sleeves rolled to her elbows, apron tied neatly at her waist. Flour dust settled on her fingertips as she kneaded dough, her movements steady, calm, practiced. She let her mind drift in soft circles, not quite dreaming, not quite waking, simply existing in the rhythm of the morning. It was a fragile peace, the kind built slowly after long months of heartbreak. Ezra burst through the back door with the wild energy of a boy who believed winter belonged to him alone. His boots tracked snow across the clean floor, but he grinned so brightly that Clara couldn't bring herself to scold him. He chattered about the horses, about how one mare gave him a stubborn fight, about how breakfast smelled better than anything he'd eaten in weeks. Clara set a warm biscuit in his hand, watching his eyes light up. A small ripple of pride moved through her, quiet but real. She hadn't felt useful in a long time. It grounded her more than she expected. Luther Kane entered a few minutes later, tall and rigid, as though carved from the same cold that encased the land outside. He offered no greeting. His eyes swept over the table, the plates she'd set out, the steaming coffee, the neat arrangement of food. For a moment, Clara waited for a nod or a word of approval. Instead, Luther sat with the heaviness of a man who believed comfort was his due, not something gifted. He lifted his fork and ate in silence, glancing occasionally toward the window as though watching for trouble that wasn't coming. Clara carried on, refusing to let his indifference steal the small warmth she'd found in Ezra's grin. But the absence of acknowledgement pressed on her more than she wanted to admit. She swallowed it down, turning her attention to the next task, moving as though she could outrun the disappointment gathering beneath her ribs. A soft knock sounded against the kitchen door. When Clara opened it, Tawa Blackthorn stood framed against the morning light, his breath misting in the cold. He held a bundle of firewood in his arms, far more than she expected anyone to carry before sunrise. His dark hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping to brush against his cheek. He nodded once, stepping inside to place the wood near the stove without speaking. The air seemed to shift around him, quieter, gentler, as though he absorbed the room's tension rather than added to it. When he straightened, Clara thanked him softly. Tawa's eyes lingered on her for a moment, steady, observing, never demanding. He murmured that the storm rolling in would be harsh, that she should keep extra wood close. His voice resonated like a warm drumbeat, low and even, filling the space without crowding it. Clara felt her pulse stumble in her chest, startled by how much could be said in so few words. Luther's chair scraped across the floor, a sharp interruption that fractured the fragile moment. He glared toward Tawa as though irritated by his very presence. Tawa acknowledged him with the barest nod, then stepped outside, boots crunching through the snow until the sound faded. Something in Luther's expression hardened after the door closed. Clara sensed a tension she didn't yet understand, a silent competition she had not invited into her life. The hours ticked by in slow winter rhythm. Clara spent the morning preparing pies for the crew, her hands working with graceful familiarity. Mrs. Calder kept her company, telling stories of past winters, of ranch hands who had come and gone, of the Christmas feasts that brought a rare sense of family to this isolated place. Clara listened while rolling out dough, allowing the older woman's voice to fill the spaces inside her that still felt bruised. She welcomed the comfort, the belonging, even if temporary. By midday, the ranch hands gathered for lunch, stomping snow from their boots, crowding the long table with loud laughter and grateful appetites. Clara moved between them with practiced ease, refilling mugs, setting down plates, basking in the small joy of being appreciated. She caught glimpses of Tawa beside the window, eating quietly, observing everything without inserting himself. His presence was a calm anchor amid the noise. Ezra sat beside him, talking non-stop, and though Tawa spoke rarely, he listened with patient eyes that softened each time the boy grew animated. Clara felt the stirrings of something tender at the sight, an image that lingered long after she carried the dishes back to the kitchen. When the last plate was washed and the dining room emptied, she stepped onto the back porch to breathe. The sky had darkened, clouds rolling in like heavy gray blankets. Snow swirled in restless patterns. She hugged her shawl around her shoulders, closing her eyes against the sting of the wind. The cold felt familiar, like a truth she had learned to live with but never embraced. Her thoughts drifted to the years before heartbreak, to the quiet dreams she once had. She wondered if it was foolish to imagine new beginnings at the edge of winter. Footsteps approached softly behind her. She did not turn immediately. She somehow already knew who it was. Tawa stopped beside her, leaving a respectful amount of space. They watched the snow together, two figures standing in the silence between storms. He spoke first, his words slow, deliberate, as though he had weighed them before offering them to the world. "You work hard," he said. "Harder than most." Clara swallowed, unsure why the simple observation felt like a balm on a wound she rarely touched. She told him she only did what was expected. Tawa shook his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the distant fences shimmering under the winter sky. "What is expected is not always what is right," he murmured. "Some give their lives away to men who never earned them." The wind caught her breath. She wondered if he knew about her broken engagement, or if he simply saw something in her that she had hidden beneath layers of quiet duty. His words reached into her like sunlight finding its way through heavy clouds. A flicker of warmth spread in her chest before she could push it down. Luther's voice cut through the air, calling her name sharply from inside the house. She flinched, the small warmth trembling but not fading. Tawa's jaw tightened, just barely. He nodded to her, then stepped away, his silhouette dissolving into the whitening storm. Clara stood for a moment, feeling the abrupt shift inside her. A subtle awareness, an awakening she had not anticipated. She returned inside to find Luther waiting in the doorway of the dining room. His expression carried an edge, as though he'd seen more than she intended to reveal. He told her he needed her to work late, that preparations for Christmas required extra effort. His tone held no gratitude, only expectation. Clara nodded, though exhaustion tugged at her. As she moved past him, she sensed his eyes tracking her with a scrutiny that felt heavier than before, as though her existence had shifted in value. Not for who she was, but because someone else had noticed her. The storm outside intensified as the day faded, wind howling against the windows, snow piling high against the porch. Clara chopped vegetables beneath the flickering lamplight, feeling the weight of Luther's earlier gaze lingering like a shadow behind her. She couldn't quite name the fear blooming under her ribs, nor the strange anticipation braided into it. Something at this ranch was changing. Something that had been still was beginning to stir. And as the wind pressed harder against the walls, Clara realized she was no longer certain whether the storm she feared most was the one raging outside, or the one quietly building within. Christmas Eve crept over the ranch like a quiet blessing, softening the hard edges of winter with faint gold light that slipped across the snow. Clara rose before dawn, tying her apron with steady fingers, even though her heart felt unsteady beneath her ribs. She had slept lightly, her dreams tangled with shadows of the past and glimmers of something new she did not dare name. The kitchen was cold when she entered, breath misting in the dim glow of the stove. She coaxed the fire awake, wood crackling eagerly, flames licking upward with the hunger of a living thing. Slowly, heat seeped into the room, warming her hands as she began the long preparations for the Christmas Eve feast. The scent of cinnamon, cloves, and roasting meat began to drift through the house, pulling ranch hands from their bunks like moths drawn to lantern flame. Ezra stumbled in first, hair mussed, rubbing sleep from his eyes as he leaned against the counter. Clara handed him a slice of warm bread, watching his grin spread wide. These small offerings of joy kept her anchored. Cooking was not just work, it was how she remembered she still had something to give. As the morning brightened, she became aware of Tawa's presence outside. He moved through the drifting snowfall with the quiet assurance of someone who belonged to the land more deeply than any fence could claim. She watched him from the window as he checked the horses, soothed a restless colt, lifted a hand to brush snow from its mane. There was gentleness in the way he touched the world, a kind of honesty rare enough to pull her gaze again and again. She turned away only when footsteps approached down the hall. Luther entered with his usual clipped impatience, chin raised, coat perfectly buttoned despite the storm that still snarled outside. He surveyed the kitchen as though it were a battlefield, assessing her progress with a coldness that made the room seem smaller. Clara braced herself. He asked if dinner would be ready by sunset, his tone sharp despite the generosity of her efforts. She assured him it would. Instead of gratitude, he offered instructions on the table settings, the order of serving, the expectation that she work through the evening without pause. She nodded, but something inside her resisted the weight of his voice, the way it tried to shape her into something less than she was. Hours passed in a rhythm of preparation. Clara chopped, stirred, baked, and tended the fire with smooth, practiced movements. The house grew warm with scents that felt almost like comfort. Yet beneath the surface, a current of tension coiled, unspoken but present. Each time Luther entered the kitchen, his eyes carried a sharpened edge, as though measuring something he couldn't name. Each time Tawa passed the doorway, carrying wood or checking on the storm's progress, he offered her a nod that steadied her more than she cared to admit. By afternoon, snow pounded the windows with relentless force, swirling in white sheets that turned the world into one vast, shifting blur. The storm had grown fierce, rattling shutters and bending tree limbs under its weight. Clara paused at the window, breath catching at the sight of the landscape nearly erased by winter's fury. A chill traveled through her, not fear of the storm, but of what the day might bring. She sensed change barreling toward her, as surely as the wind beat against the glass. When the table was finally set and the kitchen cleaned, Luther called her into the dining room. The ranch hands would eat soon, he said. Then he dismissed them all for the evening except Tawa, who remained near the fire with arms folded across his chest. Luther looked at Clara with a heaviness in his gaze that unsettled her. He gestured her closer, voice dropping as though preparing to bestow a favor rather than lay down a blow. He told her she was good help, better than he expected. He told her that since she had nowhere else to go, she might consider staying past Christmas. His words carried something oily beneath them, an implication that made her stomach twist. He offered longer employment if she agreed to take reduced pay. After all, he said, winter was harsh, and she was fortunate to have a roof over her head. His mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile if not for the coldness in his eyes. Clara stood very still, hands clasped tightly together. Luther's offer was not kindness. It was leverage. It was a reminder that he believed she was alone, without choices, without worth beyond the work she produced. Heat flushed her cheeks, a mix of humiliation and awakening anger. She felt herself shrinking under his gaze, the way she once had under another man's certainty that she should accept whatever scraps of affection or opportunity were offered. As she struggled to respond, movement shifted at the edge of her vision. Tawa stood a short distance away, silent but unmistakably watching. His presence grounded her, reminding her of the dignity she had tried to keep intact. She murmured that she would think about Luther's proposal, her voice low but steady. Luther dismissed her with a self-satisfied nod, already convinced she would agree. Clara walked back toward the kitchen, heart pounding as if trying to escape her chest. The moment she reached the doorway, the air felt too tight to breathe. She stepped outside onto the porch, letting the storm bite into her skin, welcoming the cold as if it might numb the ache swelling inside her. Snow swirled around her skirts, clinging to her lashes, hiding the tears she refused to shed. She pressed a hand to her chest, whispering to herself that she was not helpless, not worthless, not someone to be used like spare wood tossed in a stack. Yet her voice trembled. Behind her, the door opened with a soft creak. She didn't turn, but she felt him there, felt the warm steadiness of Tawa's presence before he spoke. His voice brushed the air gently, telling her he had not meant to overhear, but could not ignore the way Luther spoke to her. Clara swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. She said she was fine, though the words sounded fragile. Tawa stepped closer, still giving her space, still offering silence before speech. He told her that a woman's worth was not decided by a man who measured everything by cost. His tone held quiet conviction, not pity. He said he had seen the strength she carried, the care she put into everything she touched, the courage it took to start over in a world that had not been gentle with her. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to speak but couldn't form words. The storm roared around them, snow whipping past like restless spirits. Tawa turned slightly, his profile etched in silver light. He said her spirit was too bright for a life where she was treated like a burden rather than a blessing. The words struck her deeply, lodged in a part of her she believed frozen beyond thaw. She felt seen in a way that frightened her, a way that warmed her, a way she did not know how to hold. Before she could gather a response, the porch lantern flickered violently, shadows breaking across the wall. The house door slammed open, and Luther's voice cut through the storm with sharp accusation. He demanded to know what was happening outside, why she was lingering, why Tawa stood so close. Clara turned, heart pounding, snow clinging to her hair like scattered pearls. And as she met Luther's furious stare, she realized with sudden clarity that something inside this winter night had changed forever, and there would be no turning back. Snow softened its rage by morning, falling in slow drifting spirals that floated toward the earth like weary dancers surrendering to gravity. The storm had not passed, not fully, but it had calmed, settling into a hush that wrapped the ranch in a strange, breathless stillness. Clara awoke with a heaviness in her chest, the memory of Luther's furious eyes lingering like the echo of a slammed door. She tied her apron with trembling hands, wishing the knots she made could hold her heart together. Christmas morning should have felt like a blessing, yet something inside her feared what the day might ask of her. When she entered the kitchen, the fire had long since died out. She knelt beside the stove, coaxing flames from cold ash, whispering encouragement into the small sparks until they flared into warmth. The first touch of heat thawed the ache in her fingers, but not the ache curled deep within her spirit. She told herself she was fine. She had endured harsher men and lonelier nights. But Tawa's soft words still clung to her mind, stirring embers she had not expected to feel again. His quiet conviction had slipped into her like a beam of morning light, revealing corners of her heart she thought were lost to winter. Mrs. Calder shuffled into the kitchen, wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She studied Clara with the sharp intuition of a woman who had lived long enough to see what others hid. She asked gently if Clara slept well. Clara nodded, though her eyes betrayed another truth. Mrs. Calder did not push. Instead, she helped arrange the table for the Christmas breakfast, humming an old hymn that soothed the air between them. Ranch hands trickled in slowly, offering greetings that warmed the room. Ezra darted about excitedly, thanking Clara for the feast she had yet to serve, his youthful joy lifting her spirits despite her exhaustion. Luther arrived last, spine straight, boots polished, expression unreadable. When his gaze swept to Clara, it held a calculating glint, as though he were preparing to speak something he believed she should hear with gratitude. She avoided his stare, focusing instead on slicing warm bread and pouring coffee. The table filled with chatter until a soft knock landed at the door. The room grew quieter, attention shifting as Tawa stepped inside. Snow dusted his dark hair and shoulders, and his eyes held the calm of a man who had already measured the weight of the day. He nodded once to the group, then met Clara's gaze for a brief, heart-steadying moment. Something unspoken passed between them, something that warmed her far more deeply than the fire behind her. Luther noticed. His jaw tensed. Breakfast began, but the air felt charged, as though each breath waited for the next shift. Luther spoke about the winter herd, the spring sales, the value of hard work. His voice droned like a sermon delivered to people who needed no preaching. Clara served silently, moving through the room with practiced grace. But she felt eyes following her. Some kind, some curious, and one sharp enough to slice through the fragile peace she tried to maintain. When the meal ended, Luther dismissed the men with a wave, telling them to ready the barn for a midday task. Clara lingered near the table, collecting plates, when he called her name with a tone meant to imply authority rather than courtesy. She turned, spine straightening instinctively. He approached her with measured steps, voice dropping low enough to seem private, yet loud enough for Tawa to hear from his place near the window. He said he'd thought about last night, about his offer, about her hesitation. He claimed she misunderstood his intentions. He insisted he valued her, that he was giving her an opportunity most women in her position would seize without question. Clara's pulse stuttered. His words wrapped in silk, but felt heavy as iron. He said she should accept his offer, not because she deserved it, but because he had decided she needed it. The implication stung more deeply than any blunt insult might have. Before Clara could gather a reply, the front door opened again. A group of visitors stepped inside, brushing snow from their coats. They wore woven blankets patterned with desert hues, rust reds, night sky blues, golden sand. Tawa stepped forward immediately, greeting them with the ease of someone who shared blood and history. His expression softened in a way Clara had never seen, and warmth spread through the room like a low-burning candle. The visitors were members of Tawa's extended family, elders and kin who traveled each winter to exchange blessings and news. Their presence shifted the house's energy, turning it warmer, deeper, more alive. Clara watched them cautiously, unsure of her place but drawn to the gentle cadence of their voices and the respectful greetings they offered. One of the elders, a woman with silver-streaked braids and eyes bright as river water, approached Clara with a smile. She said Tawa had spoken of the hard-working woman who kept the ranch fed through the harshest season. Clara felt heat bloom in her cheeks, surprised and moved. She bowed her head slightly, thanking the elder for her kindness. The woman studied her with an unreadable expression, then nodded as if confirming something known only to her. Luther cleared his throat, stepping between them with forced politeness. He welcomed the visitors, though the tension in his posture betrayed discomfort. He seemed unsure how to command a room now filled with people who did not bend to his authority. His gaze flicked toward Tawa, narrowing as though the mere sight of him standing tall unsettled something deep within. The tribal group gathered around the fireplace, speaking in low tones, their voices blending with the crackle of wood. Tawa listened intently, answering when needed, his demeanor respectful yet resolute. Clara found herself drawn to his steady presence once more. The way he moved, the way he listened, the way he carried himself, everything about him felt grounded, unshakable. He glanced toward her occasionally, offering silent reassurance. Each look tightened the invisible thread forming between them. After a time, one of the elders produced a small bundle decorated with feathers and red winter berries. He placed it on the table with ceremony, explaining its purpose. It was a symbol used in winter gatherings to acknowledge intentions for the coming year. Promises, alliances, partnerships chosen with care. It was not binding, but meaningful, meant to honor the courage of declaring one's heart or future path. Clara listened with quiet fascination, unaware that the world around her was moving toward a moment she could not predict. She gathered leftover dishes, trying to steady her breathing. Luther stepped closer, voice low and sharp, telling her not to meddle in things she couldn't understand. She stiffened. Something inside her bristled at the condescension, a fire long subdued stirring into life. Then the room shifted. Tawa stepped toward the table, placing a single white feather beside the symbolic bundle. The gesture drew immediate attention. Conversations stopped. Breaths caught. The elder who had welcomed Clara nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his gaze. Tawa turned, eyes locking onto Clara with a steadiness that felt like the earth beneath her feet had tilted. He spoke with calm certainty, his voice carrying through the hush like a winter song rising from the mountains. He said he had made his choice for the coming year. Not for duty, not for tradition, but for honor. He lifted his chin, gaze never leaving Clara's. Then, with quiet finality, he said the words that froze the room in breathless silence, words that dropped like a stone into the still waters of her life and sent ripples through everything she thought she knew. I pick her as my wife. And in the stunned heartbeat that followed, Clara felt the world shift beneath her in a way she could never undo. The room seemed to stop breathing after Tawa's words, as if winter itself had paused to listen. Clara stood still, her hands trembling around the plate she had been carrying, the world narrowing to the echo of a single sentence. Luther's face drained of color, then flushed dark with outrage, but the elders remained calm, their eyes steady, their expressions unreadable yet knowing. Tawa did not flinch beneath the weight of the moment. He stood tall, grounded as a rooted oak, the feather before him trembling slightly in the warm air rising from the hearth. Clara felt her heartbeat in her throat, in her wrists, in the tips of her fingers, pulsing with disbelief and a strange, dangerous hope she did not understand. Luther moved first, his boots striking the floor with sharp purpose. He demanded an explanation, voice shaking with barely contained anger. He asked what game Tawa thought he was playing, what right he had to speak her name in such a way. Tawa turned to him, unbothered by the man's rising fury, and said that no game was being played, no disrespect intended. His tone was even, respectful, but resolute. He said the winter blessing allowed one to declare intention, not ownership, and to honor a bond he wished to nurture. His gaze flicked toward Clara with gentle strength before he faced Luther again. No one here would be forced into anything, not by tradition, not by pride, not by him. Clara's breath trembled at the quiet power of those words. She felt seen, not claimed. She felt chosen, not seized. Yet fear tangled with the warmth rising inside her, for she did not know what future those words pointed toward. Luther scoffed, calling Tawa's declaration foolish, calling Clara naive, calling the entire tradition disruptive nonsense that had no place under his roof. His tone was loud enough to sting, loud enough to expose the smallness in his authority. His anger cracked through the room like ice splitting under sudden weight. Mrs. Calder stepped forward with surprising firmness, saying that Luther had no business deciding another person's heart or future. Ezra shifted beside her, eyes round and nervous. The elders watched with stillness, waiting to see the path the storm inside the house would take. Clara felt all eyes on her, waiting for her response, yet her voice refused to form. Her thoughts swirled like snow in a frantic wind. Too many, too fast, too full of longing and fear. Luther turned to her, lowering his voice but sharpening its edge. He told her she was being blinded, manipulated, used as a pawn. He said no man who truly respected her would put her in such a foolish position. He said she was better off accepting the stability he offered, accepting the life he had planned for her. The words landed like cold stones against her chest, familiar in their weight, familiar in their insistence. For a moment, the shadows of her past engagement flickered across her memory. Another man telling her what she should be grateful for, how she should shrink herself to fit inside his version of her worth. But then Tawa spoke again, quietly enough that Clara had to still herself to hear it. He said he would not take a single step toward her without her choosing him to. That the declaration meant nothing without her voice. That he only spoke because he believed courage should not be whispered to oneself forever. His eyes held hers across the room, steady and open, offering rather than demanding. The warmth of the fire behind him cast a soft glow around his silhouette, making him look impossibly strong, impossibly gentle. Clara's throat tightened. Something inside her cracked open. Something she had kept locked away behind years of careful walls. She felt the weight of Luther's expectations on one side, pressing down like frozen earth, and the quiet, patient strength of Tawa's heart on the other, rising like early spring through thawing ground. She realized with startling clarity that one path offered security built on control, while the other offered uncertainty held in open hands. She finally managed to speak. Her voice trembled at first, a fragile note breaking the silence, but she did not allow it to falter. She told Luther she would not accept a life offered out of convenience or pride. She said she would no longer trade pieces of herself for a place to stand. She said she needed space to choose her future, not be assigned to it like a task on a ledger. Luther stepped back as if struck, disbelief rippling across his features. For the first time since she arrived, Clara felt taller than her shadow. Tawa lowered his head slightly, not in defeat but in gratitude. For her courage, for her voice. The elder woman who had spoken to Clara earlier smiled, a soft knowing smile that warmed the air. The tension shifted in the room, not dissipating but transforming, revealing new ground beneath the melting ice of fear. Clara excused herself into the cold winter air, needing space to breathe. Snowflakes drifted around her, clinging to her lashes, gathering on her shawl like fragile stars. The sky was pale and heavy, the quiet deep enough to hold secrets. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to understand the tide of emotions rising within her. Footsteps approached behind her, slow and deliberate, and she did not turn until she felt his presence. Tawa stood a few feet away, respecting a boundary even now. His breath misted in the cold, rising and fading like prayer smoke. He told her he had not meant to frighten her, had not meant to overwhelm her. He said he had spoken because watching her shrink beneath someone else's voice had stirred something in him, something that refused to stay silent. He said he admired her strength, her kindness, her resilience, and that choosing her was not an act of claiming, but of honoring the paths their lives had begun to intertwine. His voice shook slightly, barely perceptible, but enough to reveal the sincerity beneath his calm. Clara felt tears slip quietly down her cheeks, mixing with the melting snow. She told him she was afraid, not of him, but of choosing wrong again, of giving her heart to the wrong hands. She said she needed time, space, clarity. Tawa nodded, accepting every word without flinch or question. He stepped no closer, reached for nothing, only said that he would wait as long as she needed, for patience was not a burden, but a promise he would gladly keep. Something inside her settled at that, a soft place she had not felt in years. The wind shifted, brushing past them with a hush like turning pages. Clara lifted her gaze toward him, seeing not the giant man's height or his strength but the truth in his eyes. Truth shaped like hope, shaped like warmth waiting at the edge of winter. The ranch door creaked open behind them. Luther stood in the doorway, shoulders rigid, expression unreadable in the shadowed frame. His voice carried through the cold, not loud but sharp enough to slice through the fragile peace between them. He said the decision was not finished. He said nothing in this house was settled yet. And with those words drifting into the winter air, Clara realized the storm outside had calmed. But the storm inside the walls had only just begun.